What? Say what?
Say what?
Stop it! Here we go. I'm excited. Genesis chapter 22. Welcome, Dale.
Kia ora. Good
Oh,
morning.
I'm going to turn your
How's it
microphone
going?
on. What's wrong with me? There you go.
Kia ora. Good morning, Ivan. How you doing?
Nice to have you in. We've got Dale Campbell, prayer
Yep.
leader of the Auckland Church Network. He stops by every Thursday morning to dissect a Bible verse, a passage, a part of the Bible that maybe sometimes can be problematic for people. Sometimes you may have questions around it and just make you go, say, what?
That's right.
When you're reading it. How are you, Dale?
I'm good. I'm a bit tired. I'm in the middle of the busiest week, but that's fine.
Hey,
I'm
you-
here.
you and me
This is a
both.
fantastic passage.
You are also
It's a
excited.
ripper.
I appreciate your honesty as well of not just being like, I'm good, man. I'm great. We'll get you another coffee on the way soon.
I'm good.
Okay, so this passage, right? Do we want to start by just reading the specific? Where do you want to start with this? Genesis 22.
Probably don't need to read the whole chapter.
It would take a while.
It would take a little bit. But the essence, Genesis 22, out of nowhere, it's like after some time, God says to Abraham, hey, your son, your only son that you've waited a long time to have, would you kill him? Would you sacrifice him
For me.
for me? And like if you're an atheist or a Christian, you're like, what?
I think anybody would
Did
be
God-
like, what?
like this is the God of love and mercy. Like what's going on here? So that's what we want to dive into. Like, how do we understand this? What is God up to here in this story? And I think we have to be honest. Like we can't explain away. Like we're going to talk a little bit later about like how this comes through into the New Testament and stuff. And that's gorgeous and it's beautiful. But we do have to deal with the fact of what the text actually says. We're not denying it. So I just want to be really clear about that. It's like many of us will have read the other parts of the Bible where child sacrifice is explicitly criticized, like in 1st and 2nd Kings. It's like the kings are criticized for divination and other things and making their sons pass through the fire. So it's like, no, this is horrible stuff that God judges. And why is he commanding it here? Right?
Well, you would be thinking that if you were Abraham himself, right?
Well, exactly. And like in the Old Testament, we have to read it with Old Testament glasses first. And then later we'll talk about the New Testament glasses. Right? So the Old Testament glasses, this is if you read it like with a literal lens, you might see some contradictions, right? Because there's actually, it seems like God's changing.
Yeah.
Because in the previous chapter, God's talking about blessing Abraham's sons through Isaac.
So why is he saying
he's
to kill
promising
the
to do
son?
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then so that's chapter 21, verse 12. He says that. 22, verse 2, he says, "Kill your son, sacrifice your son." So it's like contradiction. And then in verse 12 of 22, he says, "Don't lay a hand on the boy when they finally get to the mountaintop." And he's ready to do it.
Because he does. I mean, if you're not familiar with the
Yeah.
story, Abraham does listen to this. And, he
Yeah.
says, take your son to this mountain. I'll tell you which mountain. Go up there, build an altar with
Yeah.
him, put him on it, and end him. And he's like, okay.
So we have to read this with the person writing this, Moses, right? And the people around that, like they knew how the story ended. And this is Hebrew narrative. This is an unfolding story. This is a story about the God who provides and the God who rewards faithfulness. So that's kind of like a first Old Testament reading, you might say. And that's a lovely story about faith, Abraham's faith in the God who, even though he said he's still going to obey God if he doesn't understand it. That's a good value, right? We're not denying the strangeness of God commanding that sacrifice, but it's a story about Abraham's faith and God's provision. And God is called Jehovah Jireh in this passage. The Lord will provide. My favorite reading of this is when we come through to Hebrews 11 and we come through to like a Christological reading of this story. So Hebrews 11 acknowledges that Abraham's having to do some reasoning here. Because Hebrews 11 reminds us, this is the great chapter where it names all these faithful people in the scriptures as examples of faith. Okay, so it says that Abraham had remembered, that it reminds us that God had said, "I'm going to bless your seed through Isaac." But it says that Abraham's kind of reasoning that God must somehow, because I know, I believe, I trust, I have faith that God is going to bless my seed through Isaac, God must somehow going to be raising from the dead. This is what Hebrews says.
Oh.
So it's
Yeah.
so it's like talking about like Abraham knew that God was up to something, and I think that's the perspective of faith. Many preachers over the years have even better have talked about the symbolism here that we see, because in the story it's like you got 2 servants and a donkey, and he's getting all this wood for the sacrifice, and he's got Isaac with him, and they get to the mountain, and they get to a certain point, so they see the place in the distance. And he says to the servants, "You guys wait here with the donkey. My son and I are going to go up the mountain, right? And we'll come back." Interesting.
Nothing to see here.
Right? But beautifully it says Abraham placed the wood for the sacrifice on his son Isaac, and he carried the fire with him, presumably on a torch. But what you've got here is you've got a father and a son and a flame, kind of like the Trinity. Taking sacrificial wood up a mountain. And this, I mean, if you're a Christian, you're like, whoa, this is
You're getting some
Christ
foreshadowing
carrying
going
the
on
cross.
here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is just awesome. And it's not child abuse, because with Christ, this is Jesus says, "No one takes my life from me." This is not the Father saying, "Hey, son, sacrifice yourself." Son saying, "No, God, I don't want to." Jesus says in John's gospel, "No one takes my life from me. I have the power to lay it down, power to take it up again." So this is really ultimately about the God that raises the dead, the God of promised life.
Wow.
I mean, there's so much there. And I mean,
My gosh.
we're pretty short on time, really, to dive into the depths of all of the questions I think people may have. But like,
Totally.
what is Abraham thinking? I know you kind of hinted towards. He's like, he has this other promise from God that he's going to bless, his descendants through Isaac. So he's kind of holding that at the same time of being called to do this other thing, which is in contradiction to that. Because how are those
Exactly.
two things going to coexist? But then, how can he go to do it when he knows that, he's living under Old Testament law, right? So he'd be very familiar with the 10 Commandments, even just as a base level.
Yes.
Do not murder is one of the big ones there. But he's like, but God has told me to do it.
I mean,
So-
10 Commandments come after Moses, which is a little bit later in the story.
Oh,
but-
okay, right,
But so
okay.
this is pretty early stuff, and
But still killing. I'm like,
I know. But I mean, he's just spent time in the verse before the end of chapter 21. It says he spent some time with the Philistines, right? And like the cultures surrounding him did this. This was normal for a God to ask you to sacrifice your son in the culture surrounding we've
like a common-ish practice.
the biblical narrative has, over its formation and unfolding, and this great story, you move from child sacrifice to animal sacrifice to ultimately God gives himself divine sacrifice. So that's the trajectory of the Bible. We've gotten so familiar with that. God's not that kind of God. But Abraham had to have that revealed to him in this moment.
Right, he didn't know that yet.
Not yet.
But
No.
he knew that God was good.
It
And he
would've been
knew what God had promised.
Come on.
So he decided
Preach.
to obey in the hopes that,
Come
yeah.
on, Tabs.
There's a lot of
good.
amazing symbolism in this story.
It's incredible.
Is this kind of a... Because I've always, every time I've read this passage and I haven't gone, say what, and I've been like, oh yeah, this is just a story.
That's right.
I've always kind of viewed it as sometimes God will give you a dream, and then even though the dream is good, you have to give it up for him to give it back to you. Is that a correct interpretation of
well,
how
I
to
think
apply
that's
this to your life?
It's a good principle, right? Is to take the good thing, offer it to God. Maybe the good thing needs to die and then be raised to be God's best.
Yeah.
I don't know if that helps or not, but I find that I have to do that. Yeah.
It was probably
Yeah.
a good thing to do semi-regularly. Hopefully
That's right.
not as extreme as what happened in this story.
That's right.
It was a full-on example, right?
But God is not the God of child sacrifice. God himself will provide the lamb, this story. That's one of the passages, one of the verses that just spring up from this passage. God himself
And I
will
like
provide the lamb.
you providing the
Come
context
on.
of what people did in the time of day and or the, in that day and all of that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dale, for your willingness to do these.
That's a tricky
things.
one.
Well, that's it's a hard verse to try and explain to people, especially someone that just reads that at face value is like, okay, what the heck? This doesn't make
Exactly.
any sense, and this doesn't even line up with who this God is supposed to be.
That's what this segment's about.
Hey, well, we appreciate you, Dale. And if you ever got a verse that you're like,
What?
Yeah.
I wonder what that's all about. Feel free to text it to us, and Dale most likely will be happy to try and dive into it for you and hopefully
try.
open it up a bit.
To try.
We appreciate you, Dale. And
Genesis chapter
see y'all.
22 is what we were reading.
we will see you next week.